James Oakes interview, take one. Got me?
Gotcha.
Marker.
So we know that his parents, when they lived in Kentucky, were in an anti-slavery church, listening to an anti-slavery preacher. We know that when they moved to Indiana, they continued to be members of an anti-slavery congregation. Lincoln later said that his father left the slave state of Kentucky to move to the free state of Indiana, in part because of his anti-slavery convictions, mostly because of the insecurity of land titles in Kentucky, but in part, he said, for his anti-slavery convictions. So we have every reason to believe believe him when he says later on that he couldn't remember a time when he wasn't anti-slavery. We have a better sense of how many blacks lived in Springfield when he was there. He had a black barber. He did interact with members of the black community in Springfield when he was a young man. Before that, I can't say. Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington Bailey on a plantation on the eastern shore of Maryland. Right? He was raised primarily by his grandmother because his mother lived on a different plantation and was owned by someone else. And he appears to have been, from an early age, recognized as an unusually bright young man. He always believed that his father was a white man, probably his owner, but we don't know for sure. He was sent as a young man to live with a family in Baltimore, which was unusual, and in Baltimore he learned to read. First, his mistress began teaching him to read, but there's a famous story he tells in his autobiography that her husband found out that she was teaching him to read and ordered her to stop on the grounds that you spoil a slave if you teach the slave to read. So she did, but he continued to find friends, white friends, who were willing to continue teaching him to read. So he taught himself to read and learned how to read at a very young age, which is another indication of an unusual temperament on his part. When his master died, he was sent back to Baltimore with the possibility that he might become a plantation slave, because slaves on plantations were divided up upon the death of a master. It was one of the most terrifying moments in any slave's life, was the death of a master, because you didn't know what was going to happen to you. Families got broken up. Communities got broken up. But again, recognized as an unusual young man, he was sent back to Baltimore to work there. And it was in Baltimore that he began to read anti-slavery speeches in newspapers. One of the ways he learned to read was through a common school reader known as the Columbian Orator, which contained anti-slavery speeches that he read. So he knew there were people in the North who were opposed to slavery. He knew all about that. And he began to dream about escaping to the North and escaping to freedom. And he made a couple of attempts. But shortly after he got married, his wife had saved enough money to be able to fund his escape. He was familiar from working in the Baltimore shipyards with getting onto a boat and using free papers, or forged free papers. So he got to New York, and in New York he met an anti-slavery leader, a leader of the black community there named David Ruggles, who warned him correctly that New York City at that point was not a good place for a runaway slave to be, and told him to keep going. Since it was a Democratic city and the Democratic Party was tied very strongly to its southern, increasingly pro-slavery wing, so the politicians in control and the police were therefore more willing police and sheriffs and marshals in other parts of the North to participate in the capture and return of fugitive slaves. And part of the reason was that New York City had the economic life of New York City was tied more than any other city to the commerce with the South. It wasn't the basis of New York's wealth, but because New York was such a huge port, it was already the largest city in the country. It had a huge commerce based on its ties to New England and upstate New York through the Hudson River. So it was the major port, and it became the major port through which cotton was exported to England or redistributed to northern factories. So it had long ties and strong ties to the South that other cities didn't have. And so that gave the city a kind of pro-slavery flavor that wasn't true of other cities. You were more secure than the slave catchers would have liked. That is, the vast majority of slaves who escaped to the north are never returned. They're never caught. And one of the reasons they're never caught is that naturally escaped slaves would gravitate toward one of the many free black communities that dotted the northern landscape. And slave catchers learned early on that they attempted to go into those communities to capture escaped slaves at their peril, right? So a few hundred slaves ended up getting returned to the South, but maybe 10,000 per decade escaped without being returned. And it became a source of real sectional animosity. It was one of the reasons the slave states seceded from the Union in 1860 and 61, is because they said quite clearly, we can't get our slaves back. You know, you're required by the law of the land to return slaves. Now, there was dispute also at the highest levels of American society, the political level and the legal judicial level, over exactly what right the slaveholders had to capture their slaves. Was it a limited right of recaption? Or was it a broad right of property, as the slaveholders claimed, which northern states insisted that it was a much more limited right, that you could not, in fact, come into a northern state and attempt to recapture a slave as if there were no Fifth Amendment guaranteeing the rights of due process. And that becomes the legal basis for the political difference between the North and the South over capturing fugitive slaves. Northern states wanted to guarantee due process rights. The slaveholders did not. Early in the war, Frederick Douglass took the position that many radicals took, which is that Lincoln should immediately take a very aggressive stand against slavery, that he should enlist blacks in the Union Army, which he did not do right away, and was generally frustrated by what he perceived to be Lincoln's slow, dilatory pace toward emancipation. It was a position that radical abolitionists tended to take in the earliest months of the war. And that position gradually changes as Lincoln's anti-slavery position becomes clearer and more aggressive. So there's another kind of convergence over the course of the war. As Lincoln commits himself to the complete emancipation of all the slaves and ultimately the complete abolition of slavery, Douglass's opposition to Lincoln naturally declines, moderates, and by the end of the war, he sees Lincoln, or claims to see Lincoln, as a friend, and Lincoln seems to feel the same way. Lincoln says so explicitly. Soldiers are recruited into the Union Army through states, and the recruitment process is to some extent determined by the 1793 Militia Act, which excludes blacks from the Union Army. So the law doesn't allow the blacks who are clamoring to be admitted to the Union Army into the Union Army until Congress rewrites the law, which it does in early 1862. July of 1862, rewrites the Militia Act. So in addition to that, over and above the legal obstacles to enlisting blacks in the Union Army, Lincoln is a bit reluctant to do so for fear of alienating the Unionist but not anti-slavery whites who he needs in his coalition to sustain the war. So he gradually shifts his position on black troops as the war drags on, and he comes to see them as a necessary enhancement of the strength of the Union Army, plus part of the process by which you undermine slavery in the South is to recruit slaves, not just free blacks in the North, but slaves into the Union Army. So his position gradually changes, the law is fixed, and in the latter half of 1862, we begin to see him allowing experiments in the recruitment of slaves into the Union Army, and with the Emancipation Proclamation of January 1st, 1863, he expressly opens the Union Army to the recruitment of blacks for military purposes. And then within the next several months, the United States Congress sets up, the military sets up the United States colored troops because, as I said, states generally do the recruitments, right? But in the slave South, if you're going to recruit slaves, you're not going to get the states to recruit. So you have national recruitment into the United States colored troops. And by the middle of 1863, that recruitment is well underway, and you start to see black troops participating in campaigns. And, you know, the world is watching as this happens and seeing how this is going to work out. And it does work out. And in the summer of 1863, there is a fairly rapid shift in Northern public opinion in favor of recruiting blacks into the Union Army based on their performance at places like Fortress Monroe and various battles in the lower Mississippi Valley. Well, he begins to give speeches early on in 1863 once the Union Army is open to recruiting black troops, and he gives speeches actively encouraging Northern blacks to enlist in the Union Army, notwithstanding the fact that they are discriminated against in the Union Army. There are limits to how much black officers can be promoted. They're not paid as much as white soldiers. And he acknowledges all that, and he complains about all that, but he says, nevertheless, look, we have a lot of skin in this game, and it is very important for us to be active participants in this war for the emancipation of blacks in the South. So he gives a number of very powerful speeches arguing for black recruitment, while at the same time he is a critic of the discriminations that blacks are suffering. And it is that issue that leads to his first meeting with Lincoln in the summer of 1863. Well, the push and back and forth between Lincoln and the radical wing of the party is going on all the time. And I've often said that you could push Lincoln in the direction of emancipation in a way that you could not have pushed, say, Andrew Johnson in the direction of emancipation. So, yes, Lincoln was pushed, but he was inclined to respond to the pushing. And there's a series of interviews he gives with some radical abolitionists in early 1862 who are pushing and meeting with him. And he's saying, you know, look, go out there and drum up support, because the more support you drum up for emancipation, the easier it's going to be for me to respond affirmatively to that pressure. So he's a good politician in that sense. He knows he wants to be pushed. There are, by the way, I don't know if it's apropos of anything, there are extremely similar conversations between Lyndon Johnson and Martin Luther King in the early 1860s, when Johnson says, look, go out there and drum up support. If you want me to push for a Civil Rights Act or a Voting Rights Act, I need popular pressure on me to help me do that. So a good politician knows how to use public pressure to get what the good politician wants, and Lincoln was that way. The question of moral motivation versus military motivation seems to me to be misguided. If you pay attention to the politics of emancipation in the North from the earliest months of the war, it's very clear that if you are anti-slavery, you are going to support emancipation as a military necessity. And if you are not anti-slavery, if you are a war Democrat or an anti-emancipation Democrat, you're going to denounce the idea of military necessity as bogus. There is no military necessity. So military necessity is an argument that people who didn't like slavery used to justify emancipation, right? But it's not just an excuse. That is, they have behind that a very serious constitutional argument, right? The Constitution doesn't allow the federal government to just go and take people's property away from them, and slaves are the legal property of their owners in the southern states. You can only justify this by reference to the war powers of the Constitution. So military necessity is something that anti-slavery people believed in, was morally right to do, but also the only legal justification for doing it. So the idea that it was a moral versus a military justification strikes me as, again, it's artificial. It's an artificial distinction. The reality of military necessity is that if you believe that slavery is the economic bulwark of the Southern Confederacy, slave labor is what keeps the Confederacy going, what made the South, the slaveholders, rich, then undermining slavery is a way of undermining the Confederacy from within. So there is a logic to the military necessity argument, as well as a constitutional imperative behind it, as well as the fact that you're likely to believe in military necessity if you don't like slavery. If you believe that nothing had happened until the Emancipation Proclamation and Lincoln suddenly changed his mind and decided to begin emancipating slaves, which I don't think is the case. Lincoln believed going into the war that the Union had the authority to emancipate slaves under the war powers if they came into Union lines. And they begin doing that. And they begin doing that within weeks of Fort Sumter. And the process by which they do that becomes increasingly aggressive over the course of the next year. So on July 17, 1862, Congress passes a second, more sweeping Confiscation Act, and it's the last day of Congress, and it's passed a whole bunch of bills, as Congress often does at the very end. And the following week, Lincoln meets his cabinet for the first time since Congress went out of session, and since he signed that bill, with a pile of proclamations on his desk based on what the various bills Congress has just passed. And among them is the first draft of the Emancipation Proclamation, which is based on the Confiscation Act, right? And in fact, in September, when Lincoln issues the preliminary proclamation, he explicitly cites the first Confiscation Act as part of his justification, his legal authorization for doing so. So he has been moving, Congress has been moving, Northern public opinion has been moving in the direction of a general emancipation since the beginning of the war. In that sense, the Emancipation Proclamation is not some earth-shaking shift in the course of the war, but a logical development in a policy that is increasingly radical in its anti-slavery implications. On the other hand, the Emancipation Proclamation does announce to the world and to the people of the United States that this has become a war for the emancipation of all of the slaves. Right? And that really does alter dramatically the sense of what the war was all about. It wasn't simply a war for the restoration of the Union, even though the restoration of the Union, even though the dissolution of the Union had been caused by slavery. There was now a sense with the Emancipation Proclamation that the only way to restore the Union permanently and guarantee a permanent peace was to completely destroy slavery. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation wasn't going to do that, but it did create the kind of political will that made the 13th Amendment possible going down the line a year later, right? And in that sense, it's a major transformation in what the war was understood to be about. Not just the restoration of the Union, but the restoration of the Union by means of the complete eradication of slavery. Well, within his own party, it was very well received. After all, Congress had authorized it. The Republicans had voted unanimously in favor of the Second Confiscation Act, and to some extent they were champing at the bit, waiting for the proclamation to come. So they were relieved and gratified and believed that this was a necessary and morally justified move. Northern Democrats were cooler towards, their reception was a bit cooler, but that splits the Northern Democrats into competing wings. Let's say the war Democrats, who came around to the idea that, alas, although we're not particularly committed to emancipation as such, it has become necessary to suppress this treasonous rebellion. And the peace Democrats, who simply denounced emancipation as a species of radicalism that the Republicans had always intended to undertake anyway, that the entire war was just an excuse on the part of this radical Republican Party to destroy slavery. So it splits the North, but by 1863, Northern public opinion is generally in favor of it, often quite enthusiastically in favor of emancipation. The South, of course, the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis denounces the Emancipation Proclamation as the most atrocious document in the history of guilty man, something like that, he says. You know, and like Northern Democrats, claim that this justifies secession retrospectively. This is what we said they were headed for all along. You see, we told you that these guys were just bloodthirsty Jacobins, and that's what it shows. Technically a private letter, but destined for publication to James Conkling, in which he explicitly speaks to Northern Democrats who want to fight for the Union and don't want to fight to free the Negro, right? And says, fine, then just fight to free, then just fight to restore the Union. But know this, that when this war is over, there are going to be a lot of people looking back and noticing that there were black people who were willing to fight for your freedom and for the restoration of the Union, while you resisted those calls for universal freedom. So he's trying to shame the anti-war Democrats into submission, and he does it very effectively, brilliantly, in that letter. The Gettysburg Address comes not only obviously after the successful repelling of Lee's invasion of the North at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. It's a sustained 3-day battle, so it's dramatic in its own terms, and it rivets Northern public attention on what's going on. If Lee can sustain this kind of thing, then the war is over, and so the victory is enormously consequential in the minds of Northerners. Whether it was militarily consequential is up for debate, but certainly in the minds of Northerners, it was a major Northern victory, but it was also came at a very high cost. So in deciding to go to the dedication of the cemetery that was being built at Gettysburg, the National Cemetery, Lincoln was making a strategic point at a critical moment. It's the second half of 1863. He has sensed that the tide of the war has changed and the tide of Northern public opinion has changed. He's become much more aggressive in his willingness to shame anti-war Democrats in the North, to bring them, to silence them, to stop the rioting, to stop their blustering anti-war activities. But at the same time, he wants to give Northerners a sense of purpose, of larger purpose for the war. And it's important to understand that Lincoln's quotation at the outset of the Declaration of Independence is not something that comes as an afterthought. Virtually every speech he gave in the 1850s quotes the Declaration of Independence. Right? And when he quotes the Declaration of Independence, in all of his speeches in the 1850s, he quotes it to demonstrate what he claims were the anti-slavery intentions of the founders. Right? If the Negro is a man, then my old faith tells me all men are created equal. Right? And he calls that principle of fundamental human equality the sheet anchor of American republicanism. Every time he quotes that, he's speaking anti-slavery language in the 1850s. He doesn't mention slavery in the Gettysburg Address, but you have to understand that every time he has said it, mentioned that in the past, it was always about slavery. So he's using, again, the founding principles of the United States to elevate the war towards something more exalted than the mere restoration of the Union. Because if he just wanted the restoration of the Union, he could have conceded all of the pro-slavery demands that were being made at him on him during the secession crisis. Right? So it's a masterful way of taking account of that particular moment in the history of the war and providing Northerners with a sense of purpose in the context of something that is, in fact, become quite protracted, quite brutal, and quite bloody. The great historian Richard Hofstadter once commented that Lincoln was horrified by the amount of death in the war. Maybe, Hofstadter said, more horrified than a person in a position of power can afford to be. And I do think the increasingly serious, sober tone of his public messages, culminating in his second inaugural address, is a function of his recognition that a valuable, invaluable service to the freedom of humanity has come at a cost that neither he nor anyone could have imagined would be necessary. Lincoln was never much for organized religion, but he wasn't an atheist. He was something closer to a deist, which meant that he believed there was a God and that human events were designed providentially, but that we human beings were incapable of knowing what the inscrutable will of God was. And that's what his final statements about God's will in this war indicate, right? That both Northerners and Southerners pray to the same God. But neither of us really can figure out what God actually intends in this war. Right? And if God wills that every drop of blood drawn from the lash shall be paid for by another drop drawn by the sword, so let it be said, God's will be done. Who are we to say otherwise? It's quite remarkable. What's remarkable about that second inaugural address is that this terrible war has ended with a victory by the North, and there is not even a hint of gloating on Lincoln's part. Right? And that also is quite remarkable. There's no, he doesn't get up on a platform with a banner that says mission accomplished behind him, right? He just wasn't going to gloat. He was too conscious of, first, the fact that now that the war is over, the North and the South are going to have to live together somehow, and gloating isn't going to help. But also, I just think he wasn't inclined to gloat under any circumstances. He was, as I say, he was way too conscious of the price that had been paid for this victory. The 13th Amendment originates in the same period as the Gettysburg Address does, that those public letters shaming the Northern anti-war Democrats come, the second half of 1863. When it looks like the North is winning, the tide of the war has changed, public opinion has changed, but it is also the case that the Emancipation Proclamation is not going to be enough to completely destroy slavery, because it emancipates slaves, even in large numbers, but it doesn't abolish slavery anywhere. The War Powers Clause allows the emancipation of individual slaves who come within Union lines, but it does not allow the federal government to abolish slavery in a state. That's still part of the Constitution, right? And the only way around that, the way around that, Lincoln tries in late 1860, in the second half of 1863, he's still operating within a constitutional framework that says states abolish slavery. So as he is engaging in all this other activity, this public relations activity to elevate the purposes of the war, to shame Northern anti-war Democrats, to justify black troops and defend black troops, he also begins to use the attack on slavery, the military attacks on slavery, to pressure the southern states to begin to abolish slavery on their own, because that's the only way it can be done constitutionally. And you see this in a series of letters in late 1863 to military and civilian authorities in a series of southern states saying, look, get abolition going, get your state to abolish slavery, get it done in Missouri, get it done in Arkansas, get it done in Maryland, get it done in Tennessee, right? And above all, get it done in Louisiana, right? And it is this series of attempts to get the states to abolish slavery that indicate the degree to which there's a constitutional obstacle, that the federal government can't actually do this. It has to be done by the states. And it's in that context that at the very end of 1863, Congress comes back into session and congressmen begin to say, look, let's just do this way. Let's just have a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery everywhere in the United States. And that's getting debated at the beginning in early 1864. It becomes part of the Republican Party platform in the summer of 1864. And in the meantime, Lincoln's serious efforts to get the southern states to abolish slavery on their own begin to pay off. And he gets, over the course of 1864, Arkansas, Missouri, Louisiana, Maryland, the loyal state of Virginia, Tennessee, they all begin to abolish slavery on their own. And why is this important? Because it requires 3/4 of the states to abolish slavery, and the slave states are never going to abolish, because it takes 3/4 of the states to ratify a constitutional amendment. And there aren't 3/4 of the states that have abolished slavery and therefore will ratify. When the war begins, there are 18 free states and 15 slave states, right? That's not even close. You can add a few free states. You can add West Virginia, you can add Nevada, you can add Kansas, and you'll get up to 21. But 21 to 15 still isn't close to the 3/4 that you need. But if you flip a series of slave states, like Maryland and Louisiana and Missouri and Arkansas, you'll get closer to the numbers you need. And in fact, on the day that Congress finally sends the 13th Amendment out to the states for ratification, enough slave states have flipped and abolished slavery to account for 3/4 of the states, right? So it's the pressure on the states, driven by the fact that the Constitution doesn't allow abolition any other way, that actually makes possible the ratification of a constitutional amendment abolishing slavery nationally everywhere in the United States. And the abolition of slavery in those individual states is in turn driven by the effects of the Emancipation Proclamation, right? The enlistment of large numbers of black troops, the destruction of slavery, the undermining of the power of the slaveholders in these various states. So you take three distinct policies, right? The Emancipation Proclamation, which is military emancipation, state-by-state abolition, which has been the goal of anti-slavery politics right from the start. Put those two together and you create the conditions for the success of an entirely different third policy, which is a constitutional amendment to abolish slavery everywhere in the United States. And you see the effects immediately. As soon as the amendment goes to the states, one by one, all of those states that Lincoln has successfully pressured to abolish slavery immediately begin to ratify the 13th Amendment. And without those ratifications, there is no 13th Amendment. So just as war weariness in the spring of 1862 brings one set of consequences, and a sense of victory, impending victory in the latter half of 1863 has another set of effects on Northern public opinion and Northern politics, so too does the stalemate between Lee and Grant in Virginia in the spring of 1864 and into the summer revive war weariness and lead to the suspicion among Republicans, including Lincoln, by August of 1864, that he was going to lose re-election. And he begins to prepare for his loss. And one of the things he does in preparation for his loss is invite Frederick Douglass back to the White House and says to him, look, there's a very good chance I'm going to lose this election. And in the meantime, not enough slaves have been emancipated under the terms of the proclamation, and we need to get as many slaves freed before this war ends. And so he invites Frederick Douglass to come up with a plan to send free blacks from the North into the South to entice more slaves than ever. So into Union lines to emancipate themselves. It's the summer of 1864, it's August of 1864. He's convinced that he's going to lose his re-election, and he asks his cabinet to sign a letter, blind, that they haven't seen, explaining that it is absolutely crucial that the incoming president be recognized as the legitimate leader, but that as much as possible should be done to restore the Union on the basis of as much freedom as possible. But it's a letter indicating how deeply pessimistic he was at that particular moment in 1864. And this is a function of his conviction that he needs to weaken slavery as much as possible before his impending loss in the November elections. In September, that begins to change. The tide of war changes again. A series of Union victories shifts public opinion back, and Lincoln's re-election chances are dramatically improved. Well, he's one of a number of people who are actively involved in pressing the House of Representatives to finally approve this 13th Amendment. The House had rejected it earlier in the year, and the Republican victory at the polls in November of 1864 gave Lincoln and his allies the kind of clout, political purchase they needed to persuade a handful of folks in the House of Representatives to switch their votes and finally endorse the 13th Amendment. Seward was, his Secretary of State, William Seward, was actually far more actively engaged in this process. And there were all sorts of encouraging and sort of arm twisting and allegedly even paying off a handful of congressmen to switch their votes, of Democratic congressmen to switch their votes. There's not been any evidence that that actually took place. Certainly there's no evidence that Lincoln ever authorized such payments. And the truth is that the votes came primarily from two sources. They came from congressmen in states that in the intervening months had abolished slavery, right? Missouri, for example, and from Northern Democrats who lost in 1864 and were therefore lame ducks and had nothing therefore to lose by switching their votes because they were already out of Congress, right? And even that took considerable pressure. Now, the fact is that a new Congress would be coming in with enough Republicans to press to get the 13th Amendment through. The problem there is that the war is still on. Lee has not yet surrendered, and the justification that Lincoln and the Republicans had for the 13th Amendment was, again, military necessity. If the war ends, if Lee surrenders, and then Congress comes back into session, they've lost their justification for the 13th Amendment. The military justification disappears. So they have to press before that happens to get as many votes shifted as they possibly can. And that's what Steven Spielberg's movie captures, the drama of getting those last votes. How they got them is a little different from what the movie suggests, but the drama of getting those last votes is quite real. And the effect that the final vote had on Congress that day was as dramatic as any vote ever taken in Congress, because everybody knew what it meant. Everybody knew that it meant something. Lee's argument all along in the summer and the spring and summer of 1864 was the only way we're going to win this war is if we make it as so difficult for Northerners that they give up on the Republican Party, and we can negotiate with the Democrats. Once the Republicans win, his justification for holding on disappears, and yet he continues to hold on. And as you say, if he hadn't held on, it might have been more difficult to get those last votes through Congress because the military justification was not there. One of the things that happens, for example, and this is in the movie, right, is that there are peace feelers being sent out by the Confederates at the behest of Northerners, and Lincoln is explicitly asked during the final debate, are there peace commissioners in Washington, D.C.? He knows that they're just outside of Washington, D.C., and he sends back a very misleading note saying, to my knowledge, there are no peace commissioners in the city of Washington, right? It's misleading, right? But he wants that vote, because if it looks like there's going to be a negotiated settlement, there's no more justification to switch your votes. It's the passage in which he's contemplating the enormous cost of the war, in which he says that everyone knew that the war was caused by slavery, but no one could have imagined the result would be so fundamental and astounding. And then he says that if God wills that until every drop of blood drawn with the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, as was said thousands of years ago, still it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. And it's not just what he's saying that it's astounding, but that he's saying it at that moment, at a moment of victory, to say something so humbling and so beautiful is unparalleled in my mind in the annals of presidential or American speech making. It's truly extraordinary judgment. This is going to seem mundane, but what I most admire about Lincoln is his recognition that if you're going to get things done in politics, you have to build coalitions, often coalitions of discordant elements of people you don't always agree with on many issues. Right? And he was masterful about that. But he understood that pragmatic requirement of all good politics did not mean you had to give up on fundamental principles. It was that extraordinary ability to balance the pragmatic demands of everyday politics with very real and indispensable principles about fundamental human equality, for example, that he never gave up on, that always organized his thinking, but which never stopped him from making sure that the coalition he'd built within the Republican Party or within the North during the war or within the nation. Because the truth is that he understood early on that the slaves in the South were part of the coalition he needed to defeat the Confederacy. He understood that women were necessary to support the war. So it wasn't simply a coalition within the Republican Party. It was a larger political coalition in the North to sustain the war effort. And it was an even broader coalition of Americans that it took to sustain the commitment to a union that was ultimately free of slavery. And it's that extraordinary ability to see this larger political picture and to behave in the most pragmatic ways while always maintaining that high principle he was committed to. I think of his career before 1854 as basically the career of a Whig politician who stayed in that groove and took a long time to get out of that groove, didn't feel comfortable getting out of that groove, but ultimately did, in part because there was no choice, there was no Whig party left. Once he becomes a Republican, once he commits himself to anti-slavery politics, there is a way in which he never abandons that fundamental groove, if you will. But every step along the way, he's making pragmatic decisions about how are we going to handle these anti-Catholic upstarts, and how are we going to deal with them, because we're going to need them in our coalition because they also tend to be anti-slavery. Right? And how are we going to deal with the conservative Whigs who don't want to hear about fugitive slaves but are willing to support banning slavery from the territories? We got to be quiet about that. You know, how are we going to handle these abolitionists who want me to immediately open the Union Army to blacks when the law doesn't allow me to and Northern public opinion won't allow me to? So he's constantly moving, but moving within a set of principles that are pretty much unchanging. So it's that balance of steadfast commitment to certain basic principles and a willingness, maybe because of that, to be pragmatic about what he needs to say, who he needs to speak to, who he needs not to speak to at any given moment, because he does have that baseline commitment to anti-slavery principles. On the one hand, the more I studied Lincoln, the more I admired him. But at the same time, my conception of politics But at the same time, I think there's too much hyperbole in the way we talk about Lincoln. That is, we attribute powers to him that he didn't have, that he would never have claimed he had. So we make him greater than he was or a greater villain than he was. So part of me, even as my admiration for him developed, I also felt this simultaneous need to sort of tamp down a little bit on the hyperbole. Right? He didn't free all the slaves with the stroke of his pen. You know, he wasn't a bloodthirsty monster. He wasn't a reactionary white supremacist. He wasn't any of these extreme things that we say to him. And he didn't have the power to do the kinds of things that we sometimes attribute to him. But was he as great as the president gets? Yeah, he was. He really was.